Shadows of Justice. The late afternoon sun painted the sleepy southern town in hues of gold and orange, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets. Jack Carter, a 68-year-old Vietnam veteran with a reputation for resilience, walked through the park, his gait slow but steady. The town square was alive with the hum of life. Children playing, couples chatting on benches, and an elderly man feeding pigeons. Jack tipped his well-worn cap to passers-by, embodying the respect and dignity of a man who had lived a life of service. Jack was heading home after a quiet afternoon at the local Veterans Hall. He had shared coffee and laughter with friends, exchanging tales of their youth. Life for Jack was simple yet fulfilling. Until that day. As he passed through the park, a commotion drew his attention. A small crowd had gathered near the fountain, their murmurs tinged with unease. In the center of the scene stood Officer Roy McDougal, a towering man known for his brusque demeanor and heavy-handed tactics. Before him was a young man, barely out of his teens, visibly trembling as he fumbled through his pockets. Jack stopped, his instincts honed by years of experience sensing trouble. From a distance, Jack could see the young man's fear. His hand shook as he tried to produce identification, his voice a nervous stammer. The officer's presence was oppressive, his stance one of dominance rather than de-escalation. Jack couldn't ignore it. He had seen too many moments like this in his lifetime. Moments that ended in pain and regret. Jack approached cautiously, his voice calm but firm. "Is everything all right here, officer?" McDougal turned sharply, his eyes narrowing as he registered Jack's interruption. "Move along, old man," he barked. "This doesn't concern you." Jack stood his ground, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Doesn't look like the boy's causing trouble," he said, his gaze steady. The officer's face darkened, his jaw tightening. McDougal wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in front of an audience. The small crowd had grown, their murmurs louder now as they watched the exchange. "Sir," McDougal growled, stepping closer to Jack, "I said move along." Jack raised his hand slightly, a gesture of peace. "I've seen a lot in my time," he said softly, "and I know when things are about to go south. Let the boy go. It doesn't have to escalate." But McDougal's anger boiled over. He stepped forward, shoving Jack hard. The crowd gasped as the older man stumbled but caught himself. Jack, ever composed, straightened up and met the officer's glare. "No need for violence," Jack said, his voice calm but tinged with steel. "I faced worse than you," and walked away standing. It was a challenge McDougal couldn't ignore. Fueled by rage and the pressure of the onlooker's judgment, he swung his fist. The blow connected with Jack's face, sending the veteran sprawling backward. His head struck the pavement with a sickening crack. The crowd erupted in gasps and shouts, their phones raised to capture the horrifying moment. Jack lay motionless, blood pooling beneath his head. The weight of the scene hit the crowd like a thunderclap. A man they all knew and respected, a man who had served his country with honor, now lay broken on the ground. McDougal's face paled as reality set in. He fumbled for his radio, barking into it for medical assistance. "We have a suspect down," he said, his voice shaking. "Need EMS immediately." The young man who had been the original target of McDougal's aggression stood frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief. Around him, the crowd buzzed with anger and fear, their murmurs growing louder. A woman stepped forward, her voice trembling as she shouted, "Someone call an ambulance." Others began dialing 911, their voices rising in a chorus of urgency. The paramedics arrived quickly, their faces grim as they assessed Jack's condition. "Head trauma. Possible brain injury," one of them muttered. "We need to move now." As they loaded Jack onto the stretcher, a bystander asked, "Is he going to be okay?" The paramedics' response was grave. "We'll do what we can." The ambulance doors closed, and its sirens wailed as it sped away. But the tension in the park remained thick, the crowd turning their attention to McDougal. A man stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos. We saw what you did. That wasn't self-defense." McDougal, his face a mask of panic and defiance, barked back. He interfered with police business. "You don't know what you're talking about." But the crowd wasn't buying it. Phones were still recording, their cameras pointed at the officer who had just assaulted an unarmed veteran. The whispers of police brutality and justice for Jack rippled through the gathering. McDougal's backup arrived, the officers pushing the crowd back and trying to control the growing unrest. But the damage was done. The video footage would soon flood social media, the truth spreading far beyond the park. Hours later, in a hospital room filled with the hum of machines, Jack lay still. The doctors worked to relieve the swelling in his brain, their faces etched with concern. Outside, friends and family gathered, their emotions a mix of anger and grief. Among them was Jack's son, Michael Carter, a man whose life was dedicated to justice. Michael had spent years fighting for civil rights as the state attorney general. But this was different. This wasn't just a case. This was his father, a man who had taught him the value of integrity and resilience, lying unconscious because of one officer's unchecked aggression. As Michael stood beside his father's bed, he clenched his fists, his mind racing with the enormity of what lay ahead. This wasn't just about Jack. It was about a system that allowed officers like McDougal to operate without accountability. Michael's resolve hardened. He would not let this stand. This fight wasn't just personal. It was a battle for justice, for reform, and for the countless others who had suffered in silence. The officer who had assaulted his father had no idea what he had ignited. Michael Carter was coming, and he wouldn't stop until every stone was turned and every lie exposed. This was the beginning of a reckoning. The echoes of injustice. The hospital room was eerily quiet except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Michael Carter stood by his father's bed, his hand resting lightly on Jack's. The man who had once been a pillar of strength now lay motionless, his face pale, his breathing shallow. Tubes and wires connected him to machines that kept him alive, but Michael's mind was already racing toward the future. He knew this moment wasn't just about his father. It was about something much bigger. Michael had spent the night poring over case files, police misconduct reports, and videos of his father's assault. He didn't just want justice for Jack. He wanted to dismantle the system that allowed officers like McDougal to operate with impunity. He had seen it too many times before. Cases swept under the rug, officers shielded by their departments, and victims silenced. But this time, the victim was Jack Carter. And Michael wasn't just anyone. He was the state attorney general, with the authority and determination to bring this fight to the forefront. The first glimmers of morning light filtered through the hospital blinds as Michael's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. It was his lead investigator, Maria Lopez. "We've got something," Maria said, her voice sharp and precise. As always, internal memos, complaint files, everything on McDougal. "It's worse than we thought." Michael leaned against the hospital wall, his jaw tightening. "How bad?" "Years of misconduct," Maria replied. "Dozens of complaints ranging from excessive force to racially motivated stops. All of them buried. The department's been protecting him." Michael closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed ignited a simmering rage within him. "What about the chief?" he asked. "There's evidence that he signed off on dismissing most of the complaints," Maria said. "It's all in the files. This isn't just about McDougal. It's systemic." Michael nodded, his mind already formulating a plan. "Keep digging," he said. "I want every piece of evidence on my desk by noon." Back at his office, Michael assembled his legal team. The atmosphere in the room was electric, charged with determination. The table was covered in files, each one a damning piece of evidence against McDougal and the police department. Michael stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding, his voice calm but resolute. "This isn't just about one officer," he began, addressing his team. "This is about a system that has failed to hold its own accountable, It's about decades of injustice that have gone unchecked. And now we have the chance to change that." His words were met with nods of agreement. The team was experienced, a mix of seasoned attorneys and young, idealistic lawyers eager to make a difference. Maria spoke up, holding a stack of files. "We've got videos, witness statements, and now these internal memos. It's enough to press charges against McDougal and launch a broader investigation into the department." Michael glanced at the files, then at his team. "Good," he said. "But this isn't just about winning in court. This is about winning in the court of public opinion. We need to make sure the truth is undeniable. Every piece of evidence, every story needs to be presented clearly and compellingly." The room buzzed with activity as the team got to work. Michael knew the stakes were high. The public outcry was growing, fueled by the viral videos of his father's assault. Protests were already forming outside the police station, with signs demanding justice for Jack and an end to police brutality. But Michael also knew how quickly public sentiment could shift. He had seen it happen before, outrage turning to apathy as the news cycle moved on. He couldn't let that happen here. He wouldn't. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Roy McDougal was feeling the pressure. He sat in his small, dimly lit apartment, the blinds drawn tightly shut. The once confident cop now looked like a shell of himself. His hands trembled as he scrolled through the news on his phone. Every headline was another blow. Veteran assaulted by police officer. Calls for justice sweep small southern town. State Attorney General takes on police corruption. The videos were everywhere. Clips of Jack Carter stepping in to de-escalate the situation, followed by McDougal's violent response. The footage was damning, and McDougal knew it. No amount of spin or lies could erase what the world had seen. His phone buzzed, and he hesitated before answering. It was his lawyer, a gruff man named Carl Freeman. "You need to prepare yourself," Freeman said, his tone flat. "The Attorney General is coming after you hard. He's got evidence, and he's not letting this go." McDougal's voice was shaky. "What do I do?" Freeman sighed. "We might be able to cut a deal, but it won't be pretty. You're looking at jail time, Roy. A lot of it." McDougal slammed his fist on the table, the sound echoing in the empty apartment. "This is all being blown out of proportion. That old man, he got in my face. What was I supposed to do?" Freeman's voice turned cold. "You were supposed to do your job without putting a man in a coma. And now you're going to pay for it." McDougal hung up, his breathing heavy. He felt the walls closing in, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. For years, he had operated with impunity, confident that the department would protect him. But now, that protection was gone, and he was alone. At the courthouse, Michael held a press conference. The steps were crowded with reporters, their cameras trained on him as he stepped up to the podium. Behind him stood his team, a united front against the corruption they were about to expose. Michael's voice was steady as he addressed the crowd. "What happened to my father, Jack Carter, is not an isolated incident. It is the result of a broken system that has allowed officers like Roy McDougal to act without accountability. Today, we are taking the first steps toward justice." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the crowd. "We are pressing charges against Officer McDougal for assault and misconduct. But this is just the beginning. We are also launching a full investigation into the police department's handling of complaints, its culture of silence, and its failure to hold its officers accountable." The reporters peppered him with questions, but Michael's resolve never wavered. He knew the road ahead would be long and grueling, but he was ready. This fight wasn't just about his father. It was about every person who had been failed by the system. And Michael wouldn't stop until justice was served. As he left the podium, the chants of protesters filled the air. "Justice for Jack," they cried. "No more cover-ups." Michael felt a surge of determination. The battle had only just begun, but he was ready to see it through. Across town, in the shadows of his apartment, Roy McDougal watched the press conference on TV. He saw Michael's unwavering determination, the fire in his eyes, and he felt a chill run down his spine. For the first time, McDougal realized the truth. This wasn't just a fight for justice. This was a reckoning, and he was at the center of it. Rising tempers and hidden truths. The early morning light streamed into Michael Carter's office, illuminating the stacks of files and folders that had accumulated over the last 2 days. He hadn't slept much, maybe an hour or two here and there, but his resolve burned brighter than ever. Every piece of evidence he uncovered brought him closer to not just holding Officer Roy McDougal accountable, but also dismantling the corrupt system that had allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. Maria Lopes entered the office, her expression grim but focused. She placed another file on Michael's already crowded desk. "You're not going to like this," she said, folding her arms. Michael leaned forward, flipping through the pages. His eyes scanned the words quickly, his jaw tightening with every sentence. The file was filled with internal memos, complaints, and disciplinary reports about McDougal. Some were incomplete, others blatantly altered. But the pattern was clear. McDougal's actions had been protected, and in some cases, outright encouraged by the department. "This isn't just negligence," Michael said, his voice low but heavy with anger. "This is a coordinated effort to bury the truth." Maria nodded. "It gets worse. There's evidence that the police chief personally intervened to suppress several complaints. We're looking at a department-wide cover-up." Michael pushed the file aside, his hands clenched into fists. "We need to go public with this. The town deserves to know the truth." Maria hesitated. "Are you sure that's the right move? The chief will retaliate, and they'll try to discredit you." Michael met her gaze, his eyes fierce. "Let them try. The truth will speak louder than any smear campaign." Outside the courthouse, the protests were growing larger by the hour. What had started as a small gathering of concerned citizens had now turned into a full-scale movement. Signs demanding justice for Jack and end police corruption waved in the air as chants echoed through the streets. The energy was palpable, a mixture of anger, hope, and determination. Among the protesters was Diane Harper, a local schoolteacher who had known Jack Carter for years. She held a handmade sign that read, "Veterans deserve respect, not violence." Her voice was hoarse from chanting, but she didn't care. Jack stood up for everyone in this town. Diane said to a reporter who had approached her, "Now it's time for us to stand up for him." The reporter nodded, jotting down notes as he observed the crowd. People from all walks of life had joined the movement, young and old, black and white, veterans and civilians. It was a rare and powerful show of unity in a town that had long been divided by its history. But not everyone in the crowd was there to support the cause. Hidden among the protesters were a few off-duty officers and supporters of the police department. They'd watched the crowd with suspicion, their faces grim as they whispered among themselves. "They're trying to tear us down," one of them muttered, his hand gripping the strap of his bag tightly. "We can't let them win." Another officer nodded, his gaze fixed on the courthouse steps where Michael Carter had given his press conference the day before. "Carter's making this personal. We need to remind him that we don't back down." Meanwhile, in a darkened office at the police station, Chief Leland Green paced back and forth, his face lined with stress. The once confident leader now looked haggard, his shoulders slumped as he reviewed the evidence piling up against his department. The door creaked open, and Deputy Chief Marcus Heller stepped inside. He was younger, sharper, and far more calculating than Green, a man who knew how to play both sides of the game. "You're losing control," Heller said bluntly, leaning against the wall. "The protests are growing, and Carter's got enough evidence to bury us." Green glared at him. "You think I don't know that? I'm the one who's been trying to hold this department together while you've been sitting on your hands." Heller smirked, unbothered by the chief's anger. "Relax, Leland. I'm not here to point fingers. I'm here to offer a solution." Green stopped pacing, his brow furrowed. "What kind of solution?" "Damage control," Heller said, his tone smooth and confident. We throw McDougal under the bus, make him the scapegoat. We admit to some minor failures in oversight, promise reform, and shift the narrative. Green shook his head. That won't work. Carter's not going to stop at McDougal. He's already digging into the department. If he finds out how deep this goes, Heller shrugged. Then we make sure he doesn't. We control what he sees, spin the story our way. It's better than letting him burn the whole department to the ground. Green hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He knew Heller was right. Sacrificing McDougal might buy them some time, but it wouldn't solve the underlying problem. And deep down, Green knew they were running out of options. Back at the hospital, Jack Carter's condition remained unchanged. The doctors had done everything they could to stabilize him, but the coma showed no signs of lifting. His friends and family kept a constant vigil, their hope wavering but never fading entirely. Michael visited every evening, sitting by his father's bedside and speaking softly, even though he knew Jack couldn't hear him. "Hey, Dad," Michael said one night, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know you tell me to stay calm, to be patient, but I can't. Not this time. They need to be held accountable." He paused, his throat tightening as he looked at his father's still face. "You taught me to fight for what's right, no matter how hard it gets, so that's what I'm going to do. For you. For everyone." The rhythmic beeping of the machines was the only response, but Michael felt a surge of determination. He stood, kissed his father's forehead, and left the room. That night, Michael's office became a war room. His legal team worked tirelessly, reviewing evidence, drafting motions, and preparing for the legal battle ahead. Every piece of evidence was another brick in the case they were building, a case that would expose not just McDougal, but the entire system that had protected him. Maria entered with a fresh stack of documents, her expression serious. "We've got whistleblowers," she said, placing the papers on the table. "2 officers willing to testify about the department's practices. They're scared, but they're ready." Michael's eyes lit up. "That's exactly what we need. If we can show a pattern of corruption, it'll strengthen our case." Maria nodded. "But we need to move fast. The department's already trying to cover their tracks." Michael's jaw tightened. "Let them try. We'll expose every lie, every cover-up. This ends now." Across town, Roy McDougal sat alone in his apartment, the walls closing in around him. His once pristine uniform hung limply in the closet, a relic of a life that now felt impossibly distant. The news coverage was relentless, and the protests outside the station showed no signs of stopping. Roy's phone buzzed, and he hesitated before answering. It was his lawyer. "We need to talk," the lawyer said, his tone cold. "Carter's building a case against the department. If you don't cooperate, they're going to pin everything on you." Roy's stomach churned. "What do you mean?" "They're setting you up as the fall guy," the lawyer said bluntly. "If you don't cut a deal, you're looking at serious prison time." Roy's hands trembled as he clutched the phone. "What kind of deal?" "Testify against the department," the lawyer said. "Give Carter what he wants. It's your only chance." Roy didn't respond, his mind racing. For the first time, he realized just how alone he was. The department he had trusted to protect him was now turning against him. And Michael Carter was closing in fast. As the call ended, Roy stared at the phone in his hand, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. He knew he was running out of time, and the storm was just beginning. The battle lines are drawn. The tension in the air was palpable as Michael Carter stood in the center of his office, a silent storm brewing inside him. The walls around him were lined with evidence, photos, memos, legal documents, all pointing to one undeniable conclusion. The corruption within the police department ran deeper than even he had anticipated. Maria Lopez entered, holding a file so thick it seemed to groan under its own weight. She placed it on the table with a thud, drawing the attention of the entire legal team. "This," she began, "is the smoking gun." Michael stepped forward, flipping through the documents with practiced precision. His eyes scanned the pages, absorbing the damning details. It was worse than he'd thought. The file contained internal emails between high-ranking officers, revealing a deliberate and coordinated effort to suppress complaints against Roy McDougal. The emails didn't just suggest negligence. They proved a conspiracy. "This changes everything," Michael said, his voice low but resolute. "We're not just looking at one bad cop anymore. This is an entire network of people enabling and protecting each other." Maria nodded. "We also have 2 whistleblowers willing to testify. Officers who were pressured to stay silent or alter reports. They're scared, but they're ready to come forward." Michael's jaw tightened. "Good. We're going to give them the support they need. And we're going to make sure the world hears their stories." He turned to the rest of the team. "We need to act fast. Once this information gets out, they'll do everything they can to discredit us. I want our case airtight before we move." The room buzzed with energy as the team got to work. Michael knew the road ahead would be grueling, but the weight of the truth drove him forward. This wasn't just about his father anymore. It was about dismantling a system that had failed countless others. Outside the courthouse, the protests had grown into a full-blown movement. Thousands of people filled the streets, their voices echoing with chants of "Justice for Jack" and "End police corruption." The signs they held were a kaleidoscope of messages, some demanding accountability, others calling for systemic reform. Diane Harper, the local schoolteacher who had been among the first to join the protests, stood at the front of the crowd, her voice ringing out through a megaphone. "We will not be silenced," she shouted, her passion igniting the crowd. "This is about more than one man. This is about a broken system that needs to change." The crowd roared in agreement, their unity a powerful force. Among them were veterans who had served alongside Jack, their weathered faces etched with determination. Families with young children held signs, their presence a reminder that this fight was for future generations, as much as it was for the present. But not everyone in the crowd was there to support the cause. Hidden among the protesters were individuals sent to sow discord, off-duty officers and supporters of the police department who sought to discredit the movement. They whispered among themselves, planning ways to escalate tensions and paint the protesters as unruly agitators. "They think they can bring us down," one of them muttered, his eyes scanning the crowd. "We'll show them they're wrong." At the police station, Chief Leland Green sat in his office, his face a mask of frustration and exhaustion. The evidence against the department was mounting, and the protests outside showed no signs of stopping. He knew they were losing the battle for public opinion, and Michael Carter's relentless pursuit of justice was only making things worse. Deputy Chief Marcus Heller entered, his expression cold and calculating. "We've got a problem," he said, tossing a file onto Green's desk. Green opened it, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the contents. It was a collection of documents that had been leaked to the press, evidence of the department's cover-ups and McDougal's history of misconduct. The story was already spreading like wildfire. "Carter's got us cornered," Heller said, his tone devoid of sympathy. "We need to take action before this gets any worse." Green leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "What do you suggest?" "We throw McDougal under the bus," Heller replied without hesitation. "Make him the scapegoat. Admit to some oversight failures, promise reforms, and shift the narrative." Green shook his head. "That won't work. Carter's not stopping with McDougal. He's coming for the whole department." Heller smirked. "Then we make sure he doesn't have the chance. Discredit him. Dig into his past. Find something we can use against him. Everyone has skeletons." Green hesitated. The idea of attacking Michael Carter personally felt like a desperate move, but desperate times called for desperate measures. "Do it," he said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. "But be careful. If this backfires, we're finished." Meanwhile, Roy McDougal sat in his apartment, his world crumbling around him. The once proud officer now looked like a broken man, his face pale and gaunt. The news coverage was relentless, painting him as the villain in a story that had captured the nation's attention. The protests outside the station were a constant reminder of his actions, and the department's support had all but vanished. His phone buzzed, and he answered it reluctantly. It was his lawyer, Carl Freeman. "You need to make a decision, Roy," Freeman said, his tone blunt. "Carter's got enough evidence to bury you. The department is already preparing to cut ties. If you don't cooperate, you're going down alone." Roy's hands trembled as he clutched the phone. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you need to testify," Freeman replied. "Give Carter what he wants. Expose the department's corruption. It's your only chance to save yourself." Roy's mind raced. The idea of betraying the department felt like a betrayal of everything he had stood for. But deep down, he knew Freeman was right. The department wasn't protecting him anymore. They were setting him up as the fall guy. "Think about it," Freeman said before hanging up. "But don't take too long. Time's running out." Roy stared at the phone in his hand, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He was caught between loyalty to a department that had abandoned him and the prospect of saving himself. Either way, he knew there was no going back. Back in his office, Michael received a call from one of the whistleblowers. The officer's voice was shaky but determined. "I'm ready to testify," he said. "I've seen too much, and I can't stay silent anymore." Michael's heart swelled with a mix of gratitude and resolve. "Thank you," he said. "Your courage will make a difference." As the call ended, Michael turned to his team. "We're making progress," he said. "But we can't let up. They're going to fight back, and we need to be ready." Maria nodded. "We've got enough evidence to file charges against McDougal and launch a formal investigation into the department. It's time to move." Michael took a deep breath, his mind clear and focused. "Let's do it. It's time to take this fight to the next level." As his team sprang into action, Michael couldn't help but think of his father, still lying unconscious in the hospital. Jack had always taught him to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. And now Michael was living that lesson. The battle lines were drawn, and there was no turning back. This was a fight for justice, for accountability, and for the future, and Michael Carter was ready to see it through to the end. Cracks in the wall. The courthouse was buzzing with activity as Michael Carter's legal team prepared to file formal charges against Officer Roy McDougal and launch a full-scale investigation into the police department. The air in the room was electric, charged with the weight of the evidence they had gathered. Each document, every memo, and all the witness statements painted a picture of not just one man's corruption, but an entire institution's failure. Maria Lopes placed the final stack of paperwork on Michael's desk, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "It's ready," she said. "Charges against McDougal, motions for discovery into the department's internal practices, and a petition to subpoena Chief Green. This is it." Michael leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The weight of the case bore down on him, but he couldn't allow himself a moment of weakness. Not now. Not when they were so close. "Once we file this, there's no turning back," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "They're going to throw everything they have at us." Maria smirked. "Let them. We've got the truth on our side." Michael nodded, his resolve hardening. "Let's get it done." Across town, the atmosphere inside the police station was far less confident. Chief Leland Green sat at his desk, staring at a copy of the charges that Michael's team had filed. The weight of the allegations was staggering. Assault, misconduct, suppression of evidence, and a broader pattern of racial bias and abuse of power. Deputy Chief Marcus Heller stood by the window, watching the growing crowd of protesters outside. Their chants had grown louder, their signs more pointed. The phrase "Justice for Jack" was everywhere, painted on banners, scrawled on posters, and emblazoned across social media. "They're not going away," Heller said, his voice laced with frustration. "Every day this drags on, the department's reputation sinks further." Green glared at him, You think I don't know that? Do you have any idea how much pressure I'm under? The mayor's been calling nonstop. The governor wants answers. And Carter's not letting up. Heller shrugged, unbothered by the chief's outburst. That's why I told you we needed to get ahead of this. Admit some fault, promise reforms, and let McDougal take the fall. Green slammed his fist on the desk. And what happens when Carter digs deeper? You think he's going to stop with McDougal? He wants the entire department. He wants me. Heller smirked. Then maybe it's time you start thinking about your own survival. Green's face darkened. He knew Heller was right, but the thought of betraying his officers, even ones like McDougal, gnawed at him. Still, the walls were closing in, and Green was running out of options. Meanwhile, Roy McDougal sat in his cramped apartment, the weight of his situation pressing down on him like a physical force. The once proud officer now looked disheveled, his uniform shoved into a corner. Forgotten. The television blared in the background, the news cycle relentless in its coverage of the case. His face was everywhere, and the headlines were damning. Veteran in coma after police assault. Corruption allegations rock local police department. State Attorney General takes on systemic misconduct. Roy's phone buzzed, breaking through his daze. It was his lawyer, Carl Freeman. You need to make a decision, Freeman said, his tone blunt. Carter's coming after the whole department, and the chief is already setting you up to take the fall. If you don't cooperate, you're done. Roy's voice was hoarse. What do you mean, take the fall? Freeman sighed. They're cutting you loose, Roy. They'll say you acted alone, that you were a rogue cop. They'll admit to some minor oversight failures, promise reforms, and pin everything on you. If you want to save yourself, you need to testify against the department. Roy's hands shook as he clutched the phone. The idea of betraying the department felt like a betrayal of everything he had stood for. But deep down, he knew Freeman was right. The department wasn't protecting him anymore. They were using him. I'll think about it, Roy muttered, his voice barely audible. Don't take too long, Freeman warned. Carter's building his case, and once he moves, it'll be too late. Roy hung up, his mind racing. He had always thought of himself as untouchable, shielded by the badge and the brotherhood of the force. But now he realized just how fragile that protection was. He was alone, and the walls were closing in. At the hospital, Jack Carter remained in a coma, his condition unchanged. The steady beeping of the monitors was a constant reminder of the fragility of his situation. Friends and family continued to keep vigil, their presence a testament to the love and respect Jack had earned throughout his life. Michael visited every evening, spending what little time he could spare by his father's bedside. He spoke softly, sharing updates on the case and recounting memories of their time together. "Hey, Dad," Michael said one evening, his voice thick with emotion. "We're making progress. We've got the evidence, we've got witnesses, and we're going after everyone who let this happen. I just wish you could see it." He paused, his throat tightening as he looked at his father's still face. "You always told me to fight for what's right, no matter how hard it gets. And I'm trying, Dad. I really am. But sometimes it feels like it's not enough." The rhythmic beeping of the machines was his only response, but Michael felt a surge of determination. He stood, kissed his father's forehead, and left the room. That night, Michael's office became a hive of activity. His team worked tirelessly, reviewing evidence, preparing for court, and strategizing their next moves. The stakes were higher than ever, and everyone knew it. Maria entered with a laptop, her expression serious. "You need to see this," she said, placing it on the table. Michael leaned over, watching as she played a video. It was footage from inside the police station, leaked by an anonymous source. The video showed a meeting between Chief Green and several high-ranking officers, discussing how to handle the fallout from McDougal's actions. "We'll admit to some minor failures," Green said in the video. "Say McDougal acted alone, that we had no idea he was capable of something like this. We'll promise reforms, get the protesters off our backs, and move on. Michael's eyes narrowed as the video ended. This is it, he said, his voice cold. This proves the cover-up. Marion nodded. It's going viral as we speak. The public's already turning against the department. This is our chance to strike. Michael's mind raced as he formulated a plan. The evidence was overwhelming, but he knew the department wouldn't go down without a fight. They would try to discredit him, twist the narrative, and protect their own. Let them come, he said, his voice steady. We're ready. As the team sprang into action, Michael felt a surge of determination. The battle lines were drawn, and the fight for justice was reaching its climax. There was no turning back now. The reckoning. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled, and a line of people stretched outside the courthouse, all waiting to see justice play out. The atmosphere inside was thick with tension, the kind that made every sound seem louder, every movement sharper. Michael Carter stood at the front of the courtroom, his presence commanding as he prepared to deliver his opening statement. This was the culmination of weeks of relentless work, of sleepless nights, and endless battles against a deeply entrenched system. Across the room, Officer Roy McDougal sat at the defendant's table, his once confident demeanor now replaced by a pale, haunted look. He avoided eye contact with anyone, his hands fidgeting on the table. Beside him, his lawyer whispered hurriedly, trying to maintain a semblance of control in the face of overwhelming evidence. Chief Leland Green was also present, sitting in the gallery with a tight expression. He knew that while McDougal was the one on trial, the scrutiny on the department, and on him personally, was just as intense. The leaked video of his meeting had gone viral, turning him into a symbol of everything wrong with the system. The protesters outside the courthouse had doubled in size since the trial began, their chants echoing through the halls. The judge entered the courtroom, her gavel striking the wooden block with authority. "This court is now in session," she announced, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "The people v. Roy McDougal." Michael rose from his seat, adjusting his tie as he stepped forward. He had spent countless hours preparing for this moment, and his confidence was unwavering. He began to speak, his voice steady and measured, each word carrying the weight of his conviction. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today we stand at a crossroads. This case is not just about one man's actions. It is about a system that has allowed those actions to go unchecked. It is about accountability, justice, and the kind of community we want to live in." He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. "Roy McDougal abused his power, and the evidence will show that his actions were not an isolated incident. They were part of a pattern enabled and protected by those around him. Today, we will prove not only his guilt but also the need for systemic change." The room was silent, save for the soft scribbling of journalist pens and the clicking of keyboards. Michael returned to his seat, his expression calm but determined. The prosecution's case had begun. The trial unfolded over the next several days, each witness testimony and piece of evidence driving home the extent of McDougal's misconduct and the department's complicity. Video footage of the assault on Jack Carter played on the courtroom's large screen, eliciting gasps from the audience. The sight of the decorated veteran being struck, his head hitting the pavement with a sickening crack, was seared into everyone's minds. One by one, witnesses took the stand. Fellow officers, community members, and the whistleblowers who had come forward all painted a damning picture of a department that had long ignored its duty to serve and protect. The most powerful testimony came from a young officer who had worked closely with McDougal. "I filed complaints," the officer said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I reported what I saw, excessive force, racial profiling. But nothing ever came of it. The reports just disappeared. I was told to keep my head down if I wanted to keep my job." Michael leaned forward. "And who told you that?" The officer hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the gallery where Chief Green sat. "The chief," she said finally. He told me it wasn't my place to question how things were done. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Michael nodded, his expression serious. "Thank you for your courage," he said, his voice steady. No further questions. Outside the courthouse, the protests had reached a fever pitch. Thousands of people filled the streets, their chants a constant reminder of the community's demand for justice. Veterans in uniform stood side by side with activists, their presence a powerful statement of solidarity. Signs reading "Justice for Jack," "End Police Corruption," and "Accountability Now" were held high as speakers took to the makeshift stage to address the crowd. Diane Harper, the schoolteacher who had become one of the movement's leaders, spoke passionately into the microphone. "This is not just about one man," she said, her voice ringing out over the crowd. "This is about all of us, about every time the system failed to protect the people it was supposed to serve. We will not stop until we see real change." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices echoing through the city. News cameras captured every moment, broadcasting the movement to the world. Back inside, the defense tried to mount a counterargument, but their efforts were feeble in the face of overwhelming evidence. McDougal's lawyer argued that his actions had been taken in the heat of the moment, that he had not intended to cause harm. But the jury's expressions remained stony, unmoved by the excuses. When McDougal himself took the stand, his testimony only made things worse. He appeared defensive and evasive, unable to explain the patterns of misconduct that had been laid bare. His attempt to shift blame to others in the department backfired, further highlighting the toxic culture that had allowed him to act with impunity. The prosecution's final argument was devastating. Michael stood before the jury, his voice filled with quiet intensity. "Jack Carter is a man who gave everything to his country and his community," Michael said, gesturing toward a photo of his father projected on the screen. "And yet, he lies in a hospital bed, fighting for his life, because of the actions of one man, and the inaction of many more." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. This case is not just about justice for Jack. It's about sending a message that no one is above the law, that power comes with responsibility, and that when we see injustice, we have a duty to act. The courtroom was silent as Michael returned to his seat. The jury deliberated for hours, but when they returned, their verdict was clear: guilty on all counts. The announcement sent shockwaves through the courtroom and beyond. The protesters outside erupted in cheers as the news spread. For the first time in years, there was a sense that justice had been served, that the system might finally begin to change. Michael stood outside the courthouse, his face a mixture of relief and resolve. Reporters surrounded him, their questions flying fast, but he focused on the bigger picture. "This is just the beginning," he said. "There is still much work to be done. But today, we've taken an important step toward accountability and justice." As the crowd cheered, Michael's thoughts turned to his father. Jack remained in a coma, but Michael knew he had done everything in his power to honor his father's legacy. This victory was for Jack, and for every person who had ever been failed by the system. That evening, Michael returned to the hospital. The room was quiet, save for the steady beeping of the machines. He sat by Jack's bedside, taking his father's hand in his. "We did it, Dad," he said softly. "We got him. And we're going to keep fighting. For you. For everyone." The machines beeped on, and Michael leaned back in his chair, a sense of peace washing over him. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt hope. The cracks in the wall had grown, and it was only a matter of time before the entire structure came crashing down. Michael sat in the hospital room long after the victory in court, the silence around him broken only by the rhythmic hum of the machines. He watched his father, Jack Carter, a man who had faced life's toughest battles with courage and grace, now lying motionless. For all the triumph in the courtroom, this moment was bittersweet. "Dad," Michael whispered, his voice wavering. "We won. But I wish you were awake to see it." The door creaked open, and Maria Lopez stepped inside, her expression soft. She carried a bouquet of flowers, A small gesture from the team that had worked tirelessly alongside Michael. She placed them on the table beside Jack's bed and turned to Michael. "The reporters are still outside," she said gently. "They're asking for a final statement." Michael shook his head. "Let them wait. This moment is for him." Maria nodded, understanding, and quietly left the room. Michael stayed by his father's side, replaying the events of the day in his mind. The guilty verdict against Roy McDougal was more than just justice for his father. It was a signal to the community that change was possible. But Michael knew the work wasn't finished. There was still an entire system to dismantle, still reforms to push forward, and still people who needed his help. Suddenly, a soft sound broke through his thoughts. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but enough to make him sit up straight. He leaned forward, his heart pounding as he realized it was coming from his father. "Dad?" Michael whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of hope and fear. Jack's eyelids fluttered. His lips moved slightly, though no words came out. The machines beeped more rapidly, signaling the change. Michael jumped to his feet and pressed the call button, summoning the nurses. Within moments, a team rushed in, checking Jack's vitals and monitoring his progress. Michael stepped back, his hands trembling as he watched them work. One of the nurses turned to him with a cautious smile. "He's waking up," she said. "It'll take time, but he's responding." Michael felt a wave of relief wash over him, tears brimming in his eyes. He stepped closer to his father, leaning down so Jack could see him when his eyes fully opened. "Dad," Michael said, his voice breaking. "It's me. It's Michael. You're okay." Jack's gaze slowly focused, his expression groggy but warm. He tried to speak, his voice hoarse. "Michael, you did good, son." Michael's heart swelled. "We're going to be okay, Dad. I promise." The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotion and progress. Jack's recovery was slow but steady, and the community's fight for justice continued to gain momentum. Inspired by the trial's outcome, local leaders and activists began pushing for broader reforms. Protests turned into town halls, and people who had once been afraid to speak out found their voices. Michael worked tirelessly, using his platform as State Attorney General to advocate for systemic changes. He partnered with lawmakers to introduce legislation aimed at increasing police accountability and transparency. The case against McDougal became a catalyst for statewide reforms, and other communities began to follow suit. The police department faced its own reckoning. Chief Green resigned under mounting pressure, and Deputy Chief Heller, implicated by the leaked video, was removed from his position. A federal investigation into the department's practices uncovered years of misconduct and corruption, leading to sweeping changes and the appointment of a new reform-minded leadership team. But for Michael, the true victory was more personal. Sitting by his father's bedside one evening, he shared the latest news. "They're calling it the Carter Bill," Michael said with a smile. "It's going to make it a lot harder for officers like McDougal to get away with what they've been doing. It's because of you, Dad." Jack chuckled softly, his voice still weak but filled with pride. "It's because of us," he said. "We don't give up. That's what matters." Months later, the town gathered in the park where the fateful incident had occurred. A new monument had been erected, a simple but powerful tribute to Jack Carter and the movement he had inspired. The plaque read, "In honor of Jack Carter, a veteran, a hero, and a catalyst for change. May his strength inspire us all." Michael stood beside his father, who leaned on a cane but stood tall nonetheless. The crowd applauded as Michael stepped up to the podium, his voice steady as he addressed them. "This monument isn't just for my father," Michael began. "It's for every person who has ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. It's a reminder that change is possible, that courage matters, and that together, we can build a better future." The crowd erupted in cheers, their unity a testament to how far they had come. Michael stepped back, his father reaching out to clasp his hand. Together, they looked at the monument, a symbol of resilience and hope. For Jack and Michael Carter, the fight for justice was not just a battle. It was a legacy, and that legacy would live on, inspiring generations to come.